We've learned racism takes many forms. It is interpersonal, systemic, institutional, and even internalized. It can feel overwhelming, but we can do something about it. And that's where anti-racism comes in. Central to anti-racism is you, your awareness of yourself, the actions that you take, the words you say, and what you choose to stand for. So what is anti-racism? It is ultimately the act of disrupting racism. But what does that mean? Well, it is an active process of identifying and eliminating racism in ourselves, systems, organizations, structures, policies, practices, and attitudes, so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. Remember, one of the key functions of racism is to uphold power and hierarchy. And so when we're doing anti-racism work, we are actively engaged in disrupting that. When a person is striving to become anti-racist, they seek to become aware of these key issues: how racism affects the lives of people who are not racialized as white, how racism is systemic, and how white people participate, often unknowingly, in racism. And it's really important to pay attention to those key areas. Let's clarify some misconceptions and have a look at some of the things that anti-racism is not. Anti-racist is not racist. And Angela Davies really powerfully articulated this by saying the opposite of racist is not non-racist. It is being anti-racist. So it's important for us to consider what we mean by the distinction between the two. Anti-racism is not equivalent to being not racist. Being not racist is a passive stance. The focus on who is and who is not racist only serves us on an individual level. It is often just a focus on morals and values. And so when people say, I'm not racist, it's often followed by, I'm not racist, I'm a good person. Or, I'm not racist, I would never say or do that. Effort is expended proving or justifying they are not racist, but no more. Being not racist becomes enough. So when we say, I am not racist, what we're actually saying is, I can remove myself from this dynamic that is impacting people who are not white in a negative way. As long as there is some other person who is racist, then I no longer have to think about, feel guilty about, or do anything to dismantle the system. When we do anti-racism work, we acknowledge that racism doesn't always look like the instantly recognizable forms. We recognize that it is hidden. It is hidden in institutions and systems, and it is even hidden in ourselves. When we acknowledge the many forms of racism, we find we each have a responsibility to fight it. That is anti-racism. And as author Ijeoma Oluo beautifully states, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And it's the only way forward. Anti-racism is also not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is the presence of, and even the celebration of, several distinct cultural or ethnic groups within a society. An example could include a school celebrating Diwali, an office asking people to bring in food to celebrate the Lunar New Year, or even multicultural festivals that showcase global dancing, food, and traditions. Whilst these celebrations and acknowledgements are welcome and can help us to learn about other cultures, they don't encourage us to look at the systems or structures that uphold white as the norm, and this keeps racism going. Multiculturalism is an output, a result, not a solution to racism. And this can be demonstrated by the fact that whilst the UK has become a more multicultural country, racism still exists. Anti-racism is also not diversity work. And when we think about diversity work and anti-racism work, it's important to understand the distinction. In terms of race, diversity work is ultimately about recognizing difference and thinking about how we can bring people considered different into the same existing space. It is about managing race rather than addressing the issues and challenging racism. It often simply advises people not to be racist. Anti-racism addresses racism directly. It focuses on the cognitive aspects and on the ways we not only engage in racism through our practices and behaviours, but also the ways in which we have been racialised to think in particular ways or see the world in particular ways. And that's why anti-racism is challenging. Unlike diversity work, anti-racism is firmly rooted in the notion of race and racial discrimination as systemic and embedded within policies and practices of institutional structures. And when we remind ourselves of both overt and covert racism, we see that diversity work focuses on the overt racism we can see, and that results in only surface level changes. Anti-racism acknowledges that not all racism is visible and forces us to look at the deeply rooted issues and to challenge those ideas at the levels they are created. Anti-racism is a verb. It manifests through our actions and the choices that we make, and it is a lifelong commitment. When we choose to be anti-racist, we choose to become actively and consciously aware about racism. We choose to recognise racial inequities in our daily lives, and we choose to take action to disrupt racism where we find it. Becoming anti-racist can look like this. You may move through different phases at different times, and even depending on the kind of racism that you are trying to disrupt. Remember, your anti-racist work should always be backed up by your actions. Being anti-racist is ultimately about believing that racism is everybody's problem. It is a system we are all navigating our way through, and that we all have a role to play in dismantling it. And finally, a note to remind us all why we do this work and why we must do it right now.